Hello, Crusher again here from Passions. And in this episode, part 2 of the amazing Ian Redmond interview about conservation. Enjoy.
And that it turns out that I don't mind social isolation if you're living in a wilderness area, and at times I've had what I think of as the good fortune to actually spend a week without seeing another human being. When I was studying elephants underground, which we haven't even got onto underground elephants yet, but living in a cave on my own, which again is against all the rules. You're supposed to have a buddy with you so that if something goes wrong, someone can go for help. And I'm afraid I didn't follow that advice, which I would give to anyone going into a wilderness area. Best not to go alone. But unless you are reasonably competent and you get that experience of being alone in a wilderness is important to you. And I think that experience it's a part of me. The peace and sense of belonging I have when I'm in a wilderness area that some people see as sort of alien and dangerous, and I've, because of this peculiar switch in my brain that says, no, that's wonderful. Look at it. Look at the shape. Look at the pattern. Look at the color. And particularly if it's a warm wilderness area, because I do like warm weather. Then, but if it turns cold, and obviously where mountain gorillas live, the research center was at 10,000 feet. Now it's in the nearby town because of the security situation with armed militias in the DRC, potentially coming over the border to kidnap people, that sort of thing. It means that now the research center is not in the forest. And actually that's better, because whenever there's a research center somewhere for decades, it gradually becomes like a little intrusive human settlement in what is already a very small national park. So I think Diane always felt that eventually the research center would go back to the forest. And that has happened, although it was quite painful to watch the process. And of course, it was associated with one of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century, the Rwandan genocide and the civil war and the suffering and everything, which having fallen in love with the country and the people, was very difficult to watch. Do you ever worry about your own personal safety, or is it just what you're doing, the work you're doing is just kind of almost all-consuming, or do you worry about your personal safety in this? Because there's some pretty hairy moments, if you like, if you pardon the pun. Yes, and in the literal sense, the hairier the better. But I consider myself a very cautious person, but many people who know me don't agree with that assessment. And I say, well, I assess the risk, and if I think I can handle whatever it is, then I will move towards it to find out what it is. So yes, in trying to photograph wildlife, I will use my knowledge of animal behavior and sometimes animal vocalizations to reassure the animal, because in that moment, if you're walking along a trail in a wilderness area and you come around a corner and there is an animal, depending what the animal is, for both of you, it's probably an alarming experience, because the animal will see a human, and generally that means danger, and have I got room to get away is most animals' instinctive thought. What's the flight distance? And if there's room to get away, they will just run away. But if you're inadvertently so close that they feel, I haven't got room to run away, it's what's known as flight or fight. Do you flee, or do you fight the danger that suddenly you're presented with? And if you are a human that actually doesn't present a danger, How do you convey that to a startled animal? And
tricky.
so far, with one famous exception, I've got it right. And I'm not saying I'm always going to get it right, and clearly the potential for getting it wrong is there. But if it's a buffalo, buffaloes have the reputation as being the most dangerous animal in Africa, but that's a reputation described mostly by hunters who have wounded them. And so a buffalo with a grudge, or a buffalo who knows other buffaloes who have such a response, or a buffalo who grows up in a herd that sees humans as that kind of danger, then yes. And that same Sandy Harcourt was badly gored by a buffalo. And a lot of my tracker friends have been treed by a buffalo, in the sense that the buffalo has charged and they've climbed up a tree and they're stuck up the tree with an angry buffalo around the base, hitting the vegetation with his horns. It's usually him, but not necessarily. It could be a female who's protecting her calf. So when I meet a buffalo, I stand still. And the buffalo stands still. And we both have a moment to think, during which time I'm usually reaching for my camera or bringing my camera up, because a camera in the hand is worth two in the bag. So you keep your camera in your hand and try and snap off a shot. Or since they invented small, easily portable video cameras that give a decent image, I've been carrying a video camera from which you can grab stills of the interesting moments. And because what fascinates me is animal behavior. So if I can film an animal behaving, then that's great. And if it's not reacting to me, that's better. But if it's reacting to me, then that could be interesting. Anyway, so yes, with buffalo, what's always happened to me is usually they've run away, and usually before I've got the photograph or the video. So that's frustrating, but it's safe. And that colors, your experience colors your next response. So whatever I do, there is a story which I don't know how long we've got, but
we're still going strong.
A radio series for Radio 4 many years ago, when they had a 10-minute slot on a Friday just before noon, where there was a gap, and they had various series of short sort of storytelling programs. So I started a series called Bushy Tales. That is Tales from the Bush. And the first one, and I remember it because they printed it in the Radio Times. Bushy Tales, Ian Redmond, a worm's eye view of a buffalo's bottom. And this was a story that harks back to my early days at Karasoke, when I'd learned how to find the gorillas, because as was sort of famously shown in the Gorillas in the Mist sequence, where Sigourney Weaver playing Diane Fossey finds that the way to find them is to look for fresh dung and feeding sign and follow it, but in the right direction. So when gorillas move through dense vegetation, they're pushing plants over with their body weight, and that lays the plant down in the direction that they're going. So you can see from the underside of the leaves that it's pointing towards where the gorilla is. Whereas if you just find trail and walk, you've got a 50-50 chance of going the right way or the wrong way, if you don't know that useful little fact. So, okay, follow the animals in the direction that they traveled. And this was the first time I'd been allowed to go out without the tracker. And the reason was that the gorillas had crossed the main porter trail that goes up to Old Karasoke. And I was told to just walk down, and when you see the feeding sign on the trail, you'll find them. Okay, I don't need a tracker for that. I've been working here for weeks. I can manage that. So I'm following the trail and there's pushed over plants. And then I can hear a sound in the bushes. I think, oh, great, I found the gorillas. So I've got a bag over my shoulder, a camera around my neck, binoculars around my neck, and I go down to crawl under the bush. Gorillas are really good at this. They just drop a shoulder, and their big shoulders push through, and their hips are narrower, and they don't have any accoutrements, so they just slide through the bushes. Naturalists aren't like that. We've got a different shape. We've got legs that are too long for that sort of thing, so our bum sticks up in the air. So anyway, down on all fours, crawl through, untangling the binoculars from the vines and things. And as I come through the thicket, expecting to see the gorillas, I look up, and literally about 6 feet away is a buffalo's bottom. A buffalo, the most dangerous animal in Africa, is standing feeding, apparently thinking that I'm a gorilla, because as I approached the thicket and started crawling, I was saying, which is what a gorilla says when he wants to just tell everyone where they are and everything's fine. So that's a contact call that keeps a group coordinated when they're in dense vegetation. They can't see each other. You'll hear a round of BVs, and they're called BV, which is short for belch vocalization, because at first people just thought they were burping a lot. And then they realized, no, this is a deliberate call. It's not a burp, it's a, I'm over here, everything's fine. So as you approach gorillas, the etiquette is to keep low, not tower over them, because when a gorilla stands up, they're trying to look intimidating. So you don't want to intimidate them. Keep on the same eye level and make a sound that tells them that you're there, so you don't take them by surprise. And I think this buffalo, head down feeding, had heard the sound of movement just behind him and heard, unfortunately, had thought it was just the gorillas with whom he shares his forest home, and not a naturalist. And my first thought from this worm's eye position of a buffalo's bottom was, oh, I wonder if I get a photograph of that. But that was when I had an Olympus OM1 camera, which had a very distinctive clunk as you take the photograph. And I thought, no, a buffalo hearing a camera behind him is going to wonder what it is, because gorillas don't carry cameras. Against the photograph, so I can't illustrate that particular story. So I very quietly went into reverse, back out of the thicket. And as I came out of the thicket and looked up on the slope of the volcano, I saw the gorillas were watching this. They were all, oh, no, the humans studying buffaloes today. So anyway,
amazing.
And as I backtracked, I saw where the gorilla trail and the buffalo trail had diverged. And if I just used my panga, the machete you carry in a forest, to lift the leaves, I would have seen that underneath those bent over leaves were hoof prints. So you have to be more...
The giveaway side, yeah.
Use your eyes, use your training, and don't make silly mistakes. That could
What
have
a
ended
fantastic
painful,
story that is. That's a great story. I'm running out of time, but I can honestly say I'd love, at some point, I might have to persuade you to do a part 2 on this, Ian, because there's so much to talk about. And you tell us such a great story, by the way. It's probably just worth just touching on the COVID situation, because we're recording this in November during the pandemic, which we all know has had some huge impact.
You might be still in November. I'm on the 1st of December. I mean, I'm
oh, sorry.
Yeah, first of the month.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, it doesn't make any difference because we're still pretty locked down.
Yes,
but I get your point. Yeah, fine.
We get to go out and play tomorrow. Hurrah!
Yeah. Look, as you get to know me, Ian, you'll know that I don't know what day of the week it is. I don't know what month it is. It's perfectly normal. So obviously it's been quite a gosh, where you know, run out of descriptions, don't you, about how it's been. What I was going to ask you is, what's been the impact on conservation of the whole pandemic situation, both in the UK, but also, of course, in some of these countries that you'll be very familiar with and spent a lot of time in. What's the impact been?
The impact has been catastrophic for individuals, for families, and for whole economies. And part of the reason for that is not the direct impact of people getting this disease and dying from it or being very ill from it. And obviously that is a catastrophic outcome of the pandemic for all those families who have been directly affected. But the measures which we have, in my view, sometimes misguidedly taken to reduce the direct impact of this, what is it? It's a few self-replicating strands of RNA that we call a virus that get into cells and make them do things that they didn't intend to do. So it's a dangerous pathogen. Well, yes, for people who have been affected directly, they've had a nasty illness in some cases, which has led to death. Although it has to be said that as more and more what are known as cases, although usually a case shows symptoms, and most of these cases don't show symptoms, people who have been affected by the virus and not showing symptoms have had it and survived. So that's a result. In evolutionary terms, if you get a virus and you don't die, result. Your immune system is now primed to deal with anything like that virus in the future. And I think because this virus is so like other viruses that we've all dealt with and survived, many people are not really badly affected by it. But if you are, it's rotten. I agree. And if you're the family of someone who's died from it, it's terrible. But in an attempt to slow its spread, there has been this extraordinary global panic over the pandemic, a global panicdemic, which has said, oh, shut down our lives completely, shut down our economy. And the relatively wealthy countries in the world, well, there are still sectors of society who have suffered, whose kids are really going hungry because they haven't got work, because the work that they did has been shut down. So those decisions have had a huge effect. And I think once the tally is really done carefully and honestly, and not just dressed up in the government propaganda, which is saying this is the way we're going to do it, and anything that differs from that way you can't talk about. So normal peer review and scientific debate over the best thing to do has to be shut down. You'll see I'm quite cross about this, the normal scientific method of erecting a hypothesis and other scientists tearing it apart and saying, does it really stand up? We've seen how badly some of these mathematical models have fared, and saying, if this happens, the graph will do that. And then 3 days later saying, actually, no, it wasn't that. Actually, we got it wrong. Because it hadn't been through that presenting it at a scientific meeting and having your colleagues pull holes out of it and then refine it. So it's all been done in haste, apparently because of the panic over the potential devastating consequences, which we all fear. I'm not getting away from that. Anyway, so the panic has caused a lot of hardship and probably more deaths from hunger and malnutrition and depression and all the other illnesses that have, and the lack of treatment for the illness that you had before the pandemic that you haven't been able to get treatment for because you're sitting at home, don't go to hospital because you might get COVID. I think the impact of the measures will actually be greater than the impact of the virus. But how has that helped or hindered conservation? Well, it's shut down global travel, which as an environmentalist, thinking of the greenhouse gas emissions, is a plus. But having been a part of a conservation method that involves high-end, high-price, low-volume tourism, which is what guerrilla tourism is all about, you take a small number of people, you charge them a lot of money and give them an experience that will change their lives, and that's wonderful. But if that experience brings them within a few yards of a family of gorillas, you don't want to do it when they might possibly have a virus that can live on a shiny bamboo stem for days after the person coughed or sneezed onto it. Even if you're at the right distance, if you leave a potentially viable virus on a bit of shiny surface that a gorilla might climb or lick or eat, then you're putting them at risk. So very sensibly, as soon as the pandemic was declared, all the ape watching sites, and that includes the completely wild apes and the apes that have been rehabilitated back into the wild, and thinking of especially orangutans where they will sometimes come close to people, and sanctuaries where people go and volunteer, and they pay to volunteer to help look after confiscated animals, orphans of the bushmeat trade where their parents have been killed for food, and the babies were sold into the animal trade and they're rescued, and you hope they've got a chance of a life in the wild again. And much of that activity is dependent upon tourist dollars, either permits to see the animals or paying volunteers who come and help out, and all that has stopped. So sanctuaries in Africa that look after apes and other species are struggling, and in Southeast Asia, where orangutan conservation and welfare is often funded by tourism, all stopped. And therefore the people who work there, who are dependent on charity, are even more dependent on charity because the way of earning a living through tourism isn't there. And that's left a lot of people thinking, well, what are our options? And in some cases, sadly, that option was seen, well, I have to go back to poaching. And whilst it might not be poaching the apes, if the poaching involves setting snares or being in the forest with weapons, earlier this year, a silverback gorilla I knew called Rafiki, which is Swahili for friend, who was one of the leader of one of the tourist groups, the groups of gorillas visited by tourists in Bwindi in Uganda. Wonderful park. It used to be called the Impenetrable Forest, and now they call it the Bwindi Impenetrable National Park. And it is very dense vegetation. It's really hard work to get up and down these hills to see gorillas. And for any visitors who have done that, meeting Rafiki from the regulation 7-meter distance was a life-changing experience. And Rafiki's dead now, not because he was caught in a snare, but because some poachers who were hungry and wanted to feed their kids were in the park setting snares as they used to do before most of that was stopped by conservation work because of the pandemic. Rafiki saw them, barked at them, bah! Very loudly. Wouldn't come over on your volume modulated microphone. And I once did that in a BBC World Service interview, and it broke the microphone. I had to go into a different studio to finish the interview. Anyway, Rafiki barked, and the poacher panicked, and they speared him. And maybe he charged, and a screaming charge is a very, very impressive bluff display. But if you stand your ground, the silverback won't hurt you. And if he does, it'll likely be a swipe that you'll survive and tell your grandchildren about. But if you've got a weapon in your hand, the chances are when a gorilla gets very close to you, you're going to use the weapon. And sadly, Rafiki died, and the poachers were arrested and prosecuted. But Rafiki died because of COVID. Not COVID, but because a father wanted to feed his kids and ended up on the wrong end of gorilla behavior that he didn't understand. And yet I've been in communities in Uganda where with a project called the Great Ape Film Initiative, we through the Ape Alliance and the Gorilla Organization have a pedal power cinema. It's a bicycle attached to a dynamo that powers a projector that shows kids videos in villages where they don't have electricity and therefore have never seen television or film. And that power of film can be brought to educate them. And not only do the kids watch these films, but every window that hasn't been boarded over to keep the light out has people peeping through, and a queue of people looking over the shoulder of the person in front, trying to get a glimpse of the moving image. And Gillian Miller, the director of the Gorilla Organization, tells a story of standing at the back of the hall, and next to her is a mother of one of the children watching a female gorilla nursing her baby on the screen. And her jaw hits the floor. And she says, that's my sister. And she mentioned that her husband was a poacher and that she would be having words with him about setting snares in the forest and putting her sister at risk. That's the way to win people over, not by saying, oh, you mustn't do this, but saying, look, you reveal, and you get that moment of, wow, ooh, and possibly even a bit of ha, ha, ha in your own mind or the mind of the person that you're convincing. And that, to me, is what education is all about. But it's awfully hard to then remember that when your kids are hungry and you have no money and you have no food and there's no tourists. And if there's no tourists, there's no lodges buying vegetables to feed the tourists. So one of the proudest projects that I think the Gorilla Organization has done is teaching reformed poachers to grow organic vegetables. We hired a wonderful agronomist, a lady who trained them in the methods of not just keeping goats, but collecting the urine and the dropping and making fertilizer. And they've got bigger, better cabbages and carrots than all their neighbors because they've got this knowledge. And people who in the past, particularly with the pygmies, who there was a sort of a traditional prejudice against pygmies because they were just people in the forest, they're barely people. And the idea of people from that tribe growing potatoes was just, it was like all the jokes that pick on any race or nationality as the butt of the joke. They were seen as the butt of everyone's humor, but people weren't laughing when they were turning up at market with sacks of potatoes worth real money. Whoa! So it's that sort of education and practical experience which shapes my thinking. And helping communities get through COVID is something which the Gorilla Organization has done. Providing PPE, masks for rangers. So, I mean, there's already a rule in most ape viewing sites and monitoring sites that when you're near the apes, you have to wear a mask. And in some places, that wasn't the rule, it was a guideline. And now it's absolutely the rule because the whole world has gone mask crazy. So it has had a very mixed impact. It has led to some poaching where there wasn't poaching, and it has led to anti-poaching patrols being suspended because there's no money to pay them. But in many places, the rangers are so dedicated that they go on patrol anyway, and they just trust that eventually things will come right. And it's through charities, ridiculously, people, raising money. And now you can't even stand on the street corner with a tin most of the time while you're in lockdown. You have to do it online, as we're doing. So instead of having a conversation in a pub and recording it, we're in our respective homes. COVID has changed everything, but the possibility that having brought our economy to a standstill temporarily, we might do better as we return and change some of our practices is what's held out for the longer term conservation. This was supposed to be the super year for nature. 2020, UK was hosting the climate talks in Glasgow. That's been postponed to next year. China was hosting the Convention on Biodiversity Conference of the Parties. That's been postponed to next year. So now next year is the super year. And this year we've got another few months to get it right. The agreements that the UN is trying to get countries to sign up to that will change the way we treat nature. And perhaps instead of seeing it just as an infinite resource, which very clearly it isn't, we're running out of all these resources we treasure so much. We need to start valuing the resource itself, nature. And perhaps let me finish with a moment of optimism. And I'm going to use a sentence which I never thought I'd be able to say, but I'm really enjoying saying. I'm working with a deputy director of the International Monetary Fund to bring carbon finance to protect gorillas and elephants. At the moment, we've only done it for elephants. So forest elephants, it turns out, if you work out the impact they have on a forest in terms of the carbon that forest sequesters and stores, a forest in Africa with elephants has about 7% more carbon in the above ground carbon than forests without elephants. Now that difference is significant over a large area.
Yeah.
So it turns out, according to the calculations of Ralph Sharmy, Deputy Director of the IMF, that each individual elephant, not the elephant, but the service that elephant provides to the ecosystem, can be valued at $1.75 million. Whoa! Over a 60-year life, average for an elephant, that's about $30,000 a year, or $80 a day. Now imagine if, when a guy who lives in a village near some elephants has a poacher from somewhere else come in and say, "Psst, want to earn $200? Instead of saying $200, that's more than I can earn in a year, he says, $200? That's less than 3 days of monitoring of an elephant.
That's
nothing. So we're trying to change the value put on elephants. Ralph's first exercise in this was with whales. He went to see blue whales and was so wowed by the experience and learned about the role they play in carbon sequestration, which leads me to use another phrase that doesn't often get used in polite society, fecal plumes.
That's a new one on me.
Plumes is whale poo. But it's so full of nutrients that the phytoplankton, the little organisms that live in the sea and photosynthesize and therefore take in carbon dioxide and put out oxygen and store the carbon, the phytoplankton does much better when there are whales. So the krill that feeds on the phytoplankton that the whales eat does much better. So whales are basically farming krill. And we didn't know that. And, there were predictions, well, when the great whales were all killed by the whaling ships, then the seas would be full of krill, but they weren't. Why? No whales, no krill. No krill, no whales. So Ralph worked it out that each whale, you can attribute carbon sequestration to the value of $2 million, which suddenly makes a ship strike when ships accidentally bump into whales kind of serious. Whoa, are we going to be responsible for paying $2 million fine because we killed a whale? So greater efforts are now being made to avoid ship strikes so more whales might survive, which means that more fecal plumes will fertilize the sea and we might have a chance of stabilizing our climate so we don't suffer the ravages of dangerous climate change. And likewise in the forest, each individual elephant produces on average about 1 metric ton of dung every week, 52 weeks a year. So 100 elephants, 100 tons, 52 weeks a year. That's a lot of shit.
Do you know what a great place to end?
Yes.
Elephant dung is absolutely the place to end. Ian, I can't thank you enough for this. It's been absolutely amazing. So many takeaways for me personally, as much as any. I mean, the "you are ha will stick with me probably for the rest of my life. So
well,
thanks.
It's a hypothesis. It's a hypothesis. We have to test the hypothesis, but I think it explains a lot.
Yeah, I can relate to it though. What you're saying, I can totally relate to it. What you're saying. Okay, so how do people find out more about you? What sort of guerrilla organization and books that you've written? What's the best way to find out more about the work you're doing?
People tell me off because I don't have a website, and maybe should have. But the guerrilla organization is gorillas.org. That's not too hard. I chair the Ape Alliance, which is a coalition of lots of organizations, which is 4 as a number, apes.com. And I do put out messages on social media, not telling people what I had for breakfast, but telling them why they need to appreciate nature. And so you can find me on Twitter and LinkedIn and all
the usual suspects.
And I just started on Instagram. I haven't quite worked out how to do it properly yet because I don't know how to get my videos. You have to have it on your phone. It's really complicated. But I need a young person to tell me what to do.
I have every faith in you. Listen, I'm not so young, and I've figured it out, so you'll not have a problem.
Well, you follow me, and I'll follow you, and we'll
do that.
And spread the word.
Ian, thanks ever so much for joining me today. Wonderful stuff, and all the best. And I hope obviously next year is a bit more positive with everything that's going on. And thank you again for your time.
All things will pass, and
they will
come out of this.
They will. Thank you very much indeed. I'll catch you again soon. Thanks for joining me. Bye-bye.